Welcome back. Go ahead and give yourself a little bit of time. Mentally get here. Usually when you're coming to a class, you're walking from another class or you're walking from your car or from your dorm, and you come in and you sit down and maybe chat with your friends a little bit, and all of that process mentally triggers to your mind that you're about to start class, and we don't have that right now. So we're using this little bit of time to cue our minds that we're starting class. Hi, welcome back. Really glad you're here. Today we're talking about tissues, as you can see. Just getting my things oriented here. We started already in the class talking about the body's chemical composition. And those chemicals that we talked about, the chemical composition of the body, the molecules that we talked about, the bonds that form, lead to the production of DNA and cells, which is really where we left off. Primarily, we talked about the cells of the body. Talked a little bit about their diversity and about their shared characteristics. And now we're going to be getting into the tissues of the body. You've probably seen something similar to this many times, where we go from elements to DNA to cells to tissues, and you probably know the rest, where we go to organs and then organ systems and then an organism. Right now, we're right here at the tissues level. What is a tissue? It's a group of cells that are similar in structure and function. So we go from cells to tissues, and a tissue, as you can see here, maybe, is made up of a group of cells. And there are four main types that we're going to discuss. I'm just going to go through these quickly, so I put them here so that you'll have them on your slide. Oh, this is doing something weird. Hang on, make that go away. There we go. Okay. We have epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue, and we're going to go through each of these types of tissue. Epithelial tissue is the first one that we're going to talk about, and the yellow line that's drawing around this body, as you're watching, is outlining the things that epithelial tissue covers. So all of these yellow lines are indicating epithelial tissue lining different structures. We have epithelial tissue separates the body, or lines the exterior surface of the body, is the way you could think that. This is probably the one that we're most familiar with is your epidermis. It lines the digestive tract, lines the reproductive tract, respiratory, and then it lines all the blood vessels. Based on just looking at this, what might you think, how would you characterize or describe epithelial tissue? Just with this basic information, you may already know. But stop and think for a second about how you might characterize or describe epithelial tissue based on what you already know, pull on your prior knowledge, and this information that I've just given you here. The primary characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it covers and protects. Okay, put that on the next slide. And the structure of the epithelial tissue is such that there's this outer part right here, the epithelium. And the epithelium faces, I think you could think of it as out. So this out here, this part out here would be, if we're talking about skin, this would be the external environment. This surface of the epithelium faces the external environment, and that's called the apical surface. So for skin, we're thinking about the external environment. We're thinking about the outside world. But if you notice, many of these sort of lines that I drew earlier, these systems that we're talking about, they interact with things that are coming in from the outside world. So they may not directly be facing the outside world like skin, but they are separating our internal environment from the external environment. The digestive tract brings in food and water from the external environment. The respiratory tract brings in oxygen, nitrogen, things from the external environment. Epithelial cells are separating that. The reproductive tract, mostly things are coming from the internal environment to the external environment, but in both the male and female reproductive tract, there are openings to the external environment. Our blood vessels, these aren't open to the external environment, hopefully, most of the time, but they do carry all the things that come from the external environment. So we have this epithelial surface, the epithelium, where you have the apical, what's called the apical surface. And then you have a membrane between the epithelium and the next layer, which is a connective tissue layer. And we'll talk more about this later, but this is the dermis. And when we dig a little bit more into the skin, we're going to watch this cool video about tattooing and to kind of help you understand the layers of the skin. And just because I think tattooing is pretty cool. Even if you don't dig tattoos, it's not your thing. It's interesting to learn about how they work. So this is the basic structure of epithelial tissue. It has 4 major characteristics. These are a high rate of regeneration. 3 major characteristics we're going to talk about. We have a high rate of regeneration. Okay, what the heck does that even mean? High rate of regeneration. If you regenerate, going back to kind of a gaming analogy, often the terminology is you respawn. So you die and then you respawn. And looking at this outer layer of epithelium and the basement membrane and then the connective tissue, when we look at more images of epithelial tissue, this will be more apparent. But here in this image right here, you can see these little, these dark spots are nuclei of different cells. So most epithelial tissue has multiple layers, and these cells down here are dividing by mitosis, and as they're dividing, they're pushing the old cells up and replacing them. And this happens a lot, tons in epithelial tissue. It's highly mitotically active and highly regenerative. Even in the epithelial tissue that has a single layer, it's very, very active, and it's very, very regenerative. High rate of regeneration. And if we stop and we think, I'm going to write this in yellow to hopefully link those two concepts. If we think of where epithelial tissue is, this makes a lot of sense because it lines cavities that are either exposed to the external environment or carry things very often that are coming from the external environment. They experience perhaps a lot of abrasion. The epithelial tissue lines the inside of your mouth, lines your digestive tract. And when we learn about the digestive tract, we're going to learn more about this. So inside your mouth, you're chewing, you're biting, you have salivary amylases and enzymes that are designed to break things down. Same thing throughout your digestive tract. So these cells These are our epithelial cells, our imaginary epithelial cells. You can kind of think of them as encountering a constant bombardment. And that wears them down and that kills them, and so they have to regenerate quickly. Same thing, reproductive tract. The vagina experiences a great deal of physical abrasion. Then all of these different areas that we're talking about, these cells need to regenerate quickly. We have a high rate of regeneration. They are also, sorry, I'm using a different presenting tool, which I think is going to be very cool, but right now I'm still figuring it out. Okay, so they have a high rate of regeneration. They're also what's called avascular. Down here, here's your blood vessel, but that's actually down in the connective tissue. That's not in the epithelial tissue. This is your epithelium up here. The epithelium itself does not have blood vessels. And if we think about what we were just talking about, what I was just talking about this constant bombardment, if these cells are constantly experiencing damage, you don't want your blood supply running through these cells. Your skin, you're losing skin cells by the bucket loads all the time. You often will scratch your skin or agitate your skin, and very rarely do you bleed. To bleed, you have to get down into the vascular layer, into the dermis. So the epithelial tissue itself is avascular. And sort of like the take home, I guess, from this is that what epithelial tissue does, when its sort of major function is it forms barriers. And so the way that I like to think about epithelial tissue, and I think this image is beautiful, is it's like a shield wall. And we can relate these different things that I've talked about to a shield wall. If there are people out holding those shields on the front line, they will very often encounter injury or exhaustion if we're talking about a shield wall. So for whatever reason, in this metaphor, new soldiers have to come and take the place of those who are on the front line of a shield wall. It lines cavities, so it protects the rest of the army. That's how you can think about it. If it's a shield wall, it's experiencing constant bombardment. And if you have your outer layer of protection, or in other words, your shield wall out there, you're not going to have your supply lines running through the middle of your shield wall. That's just not smart. So your blood is your supply line. And we're going to talk more, so you can see in this image, which for some reason I just think is gorgeous. You've also got these spears sticking out. Your epithelial tissue also has a lot of protective functions, and we'll talk about that more as we move through the different systems. There are lots and lots and lots of types of epithelial tissue. This says epithelium tissue. I don't like that. It should say epithelial. Epithelial tissue. You can call it epithelial tissue or epithelium. It's neither here nor there. I just don't want that to confuse you. These are all the different types of epithelial tissue, and you can see that many of them, this bottom group is multi-layered. You do have several types that are single-layered. Whether they're multi-layered or single-layered, they still have all of those characteristics that we talked about. And you'll learn all these different types when you take anatomy. For now, just be aware that there are lots of different types of epithelial tissue, and these are actual microscopic images of these different types of epithelial tissue in different parts of the body. Muscle tissue. Stop and think for just a second about what is the primary function of muscle tissue. I guarantee you know this. What does muscle tissue do? You probably thought something along the lines of it contracts. And you're exactly right. muscle tissue, the cells of muscle tissue are specially designed to contract. There are 3 types of muscle that we're going to talk about when we get deeper into the system. There's cardiac, there's skeletal, and smooth. They each have their own distinct characteristics, and man, they're cool. They're so cool. When we start learning about how contraction actually happens, that's one of my very favorite units. But for now, just know that there are 3 types and that we're going to dig into them more deeply later. Another one that's crazy cool is the one and only nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is specialized for electrical conduction. This is something that maybe you don't think about, and this is an overview, we're going to revisit this, but that there are electrical impulses happening in your body constantly, because this is how your nerves conduct information. And other parts of your body also, this is really important, this electrical conduction. The reason that it works when you shock somebody's heart is because that's how our body operates. So nervous tissue is specialized for this. I'm going to write nervous tissue. This is what it is all about, is electrical conduction. And it's absolutely everywhere in your body. Where? Everywhere. Nervous tissue composes your brain and your neurons. And then we're going to talk in just a second, there are also these cells called neuroglia. I must find neuro. Hang on. Go back. Neuroglia. Neurons in your brain, neurons make up your nerves, which is what we're, nerves. I can't spell, guys. Nerves. E-S? Nerves? Nerves? Wow. I've done this a million times. Why can't nerves? Yeah, okay. You know this, right? This is what nervous tissue makes up. There are 2 cell types that make up nervous tissue, as I mentioned before. The one that you are likely most familiar with is the neuron. And the neuron is the one that's actually conducting information. Throughout the body, and this is the one that you're probably most familiar with, and you've probably seen images of neurons before. The cell is specialized for electrical conduction. That's why it looks all funky like this. And this is just one type of neuron. Talk about the others in detail. So the neuron is typically the one that gets top billing. If people are familiar with the nervous system at all, they're very familiar with neurons. But there's another cell type that's really, really, really important, and it's not showing up on your screen. Come on. There it goes. And that is the neuroglia. And the neuroglia are support cells. And I've just put some drawings of 3 different types of neuroglia, and we'll revisit these later. But you can see, hopefully, this sort of blue, this part right here is the neuroglia, this part right here is the neuroglia, and then these are all neuroglial cells. This sort of red thing here, that's a blood vessel, and then this purple thing, that's an axon. And what this is showing is the neuroglia attached to or supporting other cells, influencing other cells, and that's what they do. Interestingly, many times, most of the time, when someone has neurological disorders like dementia, things like that, it's actually the neuroglia that are injured, not the neurons themselves. Connective tissue. So this is the most diverse tissue type. It's wild. It's all over the place. Something that I would like you to stop for a second and ask yourself is, what does connective tissue do? I think a lot of times we kind of get in our heads about these things and we don't stop and just realize it's in the name. So connective tissue supports, anchors, links other structures together. Bottom line is it connects. Every once in a while we get thrown a bone where something's very easy to remember, very clear, very straightforward, and in this case connective tissue connects. It connects different things. The main characteristic of connective tissue, I'm going to talk about this because this is something that people sort of sometimes struggle with if we come at this from the back end. What I'm going to do, what color should I use? I'll use purple. These are all different types of connective tissue, and it doesn't really matter which connective tissues, but these are all different types of connective tissue. And this, I'm outlining the cells for you. So all of these little blobby things here are cells, and you can't really see it on this image, but they all have a nucleus that's pushed out on the edge of the cell. So I'm not going to outline all of them, but these are all cells of one type of connective tissue. And then in this image, this next image down here, each of these little things is a cell. And then here, this is a little bit more obvious. Each of these is a cell. And then here's blood. This is something that you guys are probably good with. Each of these is a cell. Those are red blood cells, and then these guys are white blood cells, which we will talk about in detail later. So looking at each of these examples of connective tissue that I've shown you, what is something, and you know, I kind of tried to give you a hint here, showing you the cells. What is something that all of them have in common? It's something about the way their cells are structured relative to other stuff. Take a second, think about that, look at that. What do all of these cells have in common? What all these cells have in common, or what all these types of these tissues have in common, is that the cells in every single tissue type are surrounded by non-living stuff. Right here. It's not like many other types of tissue where you have cells all packed together. So muscle cells are all packed together. Epithelial, obviously, because of their job, they're all super tightly packed together. But connective tissue cells, connective tissue has, the cells are all surrounded by this stuff. The stuff that is not made of cells. So if this stuff is not made of cells, and cells are what makes up living things, this is cell theory, one of our basic theories in science. And remember that in science, a theory is like the highest level. It means that process that we talked about before, where we're going through the scientific process, revision and retesting and all of that. It's been through that, it's been through that, it's been through that, it's been through that, it's been through that a bazillion times. And the scientific community has accepted it. That's a theory. So cell theory says living things are made up of cells. Oh, over here. Looking at all these different examples that I've given you, the cells are surrounded by this stuff, and I'm telling you it's not cells. So if I'm telling you it's not cells, what does that mean? Living or non-living? It means it's not living. In connective tissue, the cells of every type of connective tissue are surrounded by what's called a non-living extracellular matrix. And this is an identifying characteristic of connective tissue, is that the cells are surrounded by a non-living extracellular matrix. Another key thing, I should really make that go away. Ignore that. I'll delete that on your slides. I added that and wasn't thinking. Another thing, as you learn about connective tissue, it's sort of one of those tissue groups that can feel like, what on earth do all of these tissues have in common? So there's the extracellular matrix that we just talked about, and then another thing that they all have in common is that they are all derived from embryonic mesenchyme. What the heck does that mean? It means really, really, really early, when you were developing in the uterus. Remember we talked about that we start out as one single cell, and that's pretty wild and cool. So you got to go from that single cell to, at some point, the trillions of cells that make up a living human, right? Well, that process, you start out with 1, and then we divide and we go to 2, and then we divide and we go to 4, and then we divide, and you get it, right? And eventually we've got thousands of cells, and then hundreds of thousands of cells, and then we get up into the millions of cells. Around the 2nd or 3rd week of gestation, the embryo is at a point where the cells have divided enough that you start to have tissue that you can name. And one of those tissues is the embryonic mesenchyme. And the embryonic mesenchyme gives rise, through a process of differentiation and specialization, to all of the cells that are going to become connective tissue cells. And here, in blue, I keep pointing to it as if you can see what I'm pointing to. This is a process called osteogenesis. And these are osteocytes, and this is going to form bone. This is chondrogenesis. And you don't have to, I'm not going to ask you for these names. I'm just giving you this information. This is cartilage. Once again, I can't spell cart. I have it up there in my notes. Cartilage. So if you can't spell and people give you crap about that, be like, well, neither can my professor. Okay. And then, so that gives rise to cartilage, and I'm not going to take you through every single detail. But this is dense regular connective tissue. And this is adipose. And then this is blood cells, which sometimes seems like kind of the odd one out, and you can't really see that here. So we've got red blood cells and white blood cells, also platelets, but we'll talk about those later. Part of the reason that connective tissue is grouped the way that it is because it all arises from the same early embryonic tissue. And if you're interested, I just put this here, if it'll show up on your screen. There we go. Then this kind of gives you an outline of how that happens, the developmental process and what leads to what. All right, so that's it for tissues. See you back here next time.